Frozen in Time Introduction 2004. Frozen in Time by Owen Beatty and John Geiger is one of those books that, having once entered our imaginations, refuse to go away. It made a large impact, devoted as it was to the astonishing revelations made by Dr. Owen Beatty, including the high probability that lead poisoning had contributed to the annihilation of the 1845 Franklin expedition. I read Frozen in Time when it first came out in 1987. I looked at the pictures in it. They gave me nightmares. I incorporated story and pictures as a subtext and extended metaphor in a short story called The Age of Lead, published in a 1991 collection called Wilderness Tips. Then, some 9 years later, during a boat trip in the Arctic, I met John Geiger, one of the book's authors. Not only had I read his book, he had read mine, and it had caused him to give further thought to lead as a factor in northern exploration and in unlucky 19th century sea voyages in general. Franklin, said Geiger, was a canary in the mine, although unrecognized as such at first. Until the last years of 19th century, crews on long voyages continued to be fatally sickened by the lead in tinned food. He had included the results of his researches in this expanded version of Frozen in Time. The 19th century, he said, was truly an age of lead. Thus do life and art intertwine. Back to the foreground. In the fall of 1984, a mesmerizing photograph grabbed attention in newspapers around the world. It showed a young man who looked neither fully dead nor entirely alive. He was dressed in archaic clothing and was surrounded by a casing of ice. The whites of his half-open eyes were tea-colored. His forehead was dark blue. Despite the soothing and respectful adjectives applied to him by the authors of Frozen in Time, you would never have confused this man with a lad just drifting off to sleep. Instead, he looked like a blend of Star Trek extraterrestrial and B-movie victim of a curse, not somebody you'd want as your next door neighbor, especially if the moon was full. Every time we find the well preserved body of someone who died a long time ago, an Egyptian mummy, a freeze dried Incan sacrifice, a leathery Scandinavian bog person, the famous Iceman of European Alps, there's a similar fascination. Here is someone who's defied the general ashes to ashes, dust to dust rule, and who has remained recognizable as an individual human being after long after most have turned to bone and earth. In the Middle Ages, unnatural results argued unnatural causes, and such a body would have been either revered as saintly or staked through the heart. In our age, try for rationality as we may, something of the horror classic lingers. The mummy walks, the vampire awakes. It is so difficult to believe that one who appears to be nearly alive is not conscious of us. Surely, we feel a being like this is a messenger. He has traveled through time, all the way from his age to our own, in order to tell us something we long to know. The man in the sensational photograph was John Torrington, one of the first three to die during the doomed Franklin expedition of 1845. Its stated goal was to discover the Northwest Passage to the Orient and claim it for Britain. Its actual result was the obliteration of all participants. Torrington had been buried in a carefully dug grave deep in the permafrost on the shore of Beechey Island, Franklin's base during the expedition's first winter. Two others, John Harleton and William Braine, was given adjacent graves. All three had been painstakingly exhumed by anthropologist Owen Beatty and his team in an attempt to solve a long-standing mystery. Why had the Franklin expedition ended so disastrously? Beatty's search for evidence in the rest of the Franklin expedition, his excavation of the three known graves, and his subsequent discoveries gave rise to a television documentary. And then, 3 years after the photograph first appeared, to Frozen in Time, that the story should generate such widespread interest 140 years after Franklin filled his freshwater barrels at Stromsum in the Orkney Islands before sailing off to his mysterious fate was a tribute to the extraordinary staying powers of Franklin legend. For many years, the mysteriousness of that fate was a chief drawing card. At first, Franklin's two ships, the ominously named Terror and Erebus, appeared to have vanished into nothingness. No trace could be found of them, even after the graves of Torrington, Harleton, and Brain had been found. There is something unnerving about people who can't be located, dead or alive. They upset our sense of space. Surely the missing ones have been somewhere, but where? Among the ancient Greeks, the dead who had not been retrieved and given proper funeral ceremonies could not reach the underworld. They lingered in the world of the living as restless ghosts. And so it is, still with the disappeared. They haunt us. The Victorian age was especially prone to such hauntings, as witnessed Tennyson's In Memoriam, its most exemplary tribute to a man lost at sea. Adding to the attraction of the Franklin story was the Arctic landscape that had subsumed leader ships and men. In the 19th century, very few Europeans, apart from whalers, have had been to far north. It was one of those perilous regions attractive to a public still sensitive to the spirit of literary romanticism. A place where a hero might defy the odds, suffer outrageously, and put his large than usual soul against overwhelming forces. This Arctic was dreary and lonesome and empty, like the windswept heaths and forbidding mountains favored by aficionados of the sublime. But the Arctic was also a potent otherworld, imagined as a beautiful and alluring, but potentially malign fairyland, a snow queen's realm complete with otherworldly light effects, glittering ice palaces, fabulous beasts, narwhals, polar bears, walruses, and gnome-like inhabitants dressed in exotic fur outfits. There are numerous drawings of that period that attest to this fascination of the locale. The Victorians were keen on fairies of all sorts. They painted them, wrote stories about them, and sometimes went so far as to believe in them. They knew the rules. Going to an underworld was a great risk. You might be captured by non-human beings. You might get trapped. You might never get out. Ever since Franklin's disappearance, each age has created a Franklin suitable to its needs. Prior to the expedition's departure, there was someone we might call real Franklin, or even the Earth Franklin, a man viewed by his peers or perhaps not the crunchiest biscuit in the packet, but solid in experience, even if someone of that experience had been won by bad judgment, as witness the ill-fated Coppermine River voyage of 1819. This Franklin knew his own active career was drawing towards an end, and saw in the chance to discover the Northwest Passage the last possibility of enduring fame. Aging and plump, he was not exactly a dream vision of the romantic hero. Then there was Interim Franklin, the one that came into being once the first Franklin failed to return, and people in England realized that something must have gone terribly wrong. This Franklin was neither dead or alive, and the possibility that he might be either caused him to loom large in the minds of the British public. During this period, he acquired the adjective gallant, as if he had been engaged in a military exploit. Rewards were offered, search parties were sent out. Some of these men, too, did not return. The next Franklin, one we might call Franklin Aloft, emerged after it became clear that Franklin and all his men had died. They had not just died, they had perished, and they had not just perished, they had perished miserably. But many Europeans had survived in the Arctic under equally dire conditions. Why had this particular group gone under, especially since the Terror and the Erebus had been the best equipped ships of their age, offering the latest in technological advances? A defeat of such magnitude called for denial of equal magnitude. Reports to the effect that several of Franklin's men had eaten several others was vigorously squelched. Those bringing the reports, such as the intrepid John Ray, whose story was told in Kevin McCoon's 2002 book, Fatal Passage, were lambasted in the press, and the Inuit, who had seen the gruesome evidence, was maligned as wicked savages. The effort to clear Franklin and all who sailed with him of any such charges was led by Lady Jane Franklin, whose social status hung in the balance. The widow of a hero is one thing, but the widow of a cannibal quite is another. Due to Lady Jane's lobbying efforts, Franklin in absentia swelled to blimp-like size. He was credited, dubiously, with the discovery of the Northwest Passage and was given a plaque in Westminster Abbey and an epitaph by Tennyson. After such inflation, reaction was sure to follow. For a time in the second half of 20th century, we were given half-wit Franklin, a clock so dumb he could barely tie his own shoelaces. Franklin was a victim of bad weather. The ice was usually melted in the summer, had failed to do so, not in just 1 year, but in 3. However, in the half-wit Franklin reading, this counted for little. This expedition was framed as a pure example of European hubris in the face of nature. Sir John was yet another of those nanodals of the North who came to grief because they wouldn't live by indigenous rule and follow indigenous advice. Don't go there, being on such occasions advice number one. But the law of repetitions is like a bungee cord. If you plunge down, you bounce up, though to diminishing depths and heights each time. In 1983, Stella Lodi published The Discovery of Slowness, a novel that gave us a thoughtful Franklin, not exactly a hero, but an unusual talent, and certainly no villain. Rehabilitation was on the way. Then came Owen Beatty's discoveries, and the description of them in Frozen in Time. It was now clear that Franklin was no arrogant idiot. Instead, he became a quintessentially 20th century victim, a victim of bad packaging. The tins of food aboard his ships had poisoned his men, weakening them and clouding their judgment. Tins were quite new in 1845, and these tins were sloppily sealed with lead, and the lead had leached into the food. But the symptoms of lead poisoning were not recognized at the time, being easily confused with those of scurvy. Can hardly be blamed for negligence, and the Beatty's revelations constituted exoneration of a kind for Franklin. There was exoneration of two other kinds as well. By going where Franklin's men had gone, Beatty's team was able to experience the physical conditions faced by the surviving members of Franklin's crew. Even in summer, King William Island is one of the most difficult and desolate places on earth. No one could have done what these men were attempting, an overland expedition to safety. Weakened and addled as they were, they didn't have a hope. They can't be blamed for not making it. The third exoneration was perhaps from the point of view of historical justice, the most important. After a painstaking, finger-numbing search, Beatty's team found human bones with knife marks and skulls with no faces. John Ray and his Inuit witnesses, so unjustly attacked for having said that the last members of Franklin crew had been practicing cannibalism, had been right after all. A large part of Franklin mystery had now been solved. Another mystery has since arisen. Why has Franklin become such a Canadian icon? As Giger and BT's report, Canadians weren't much interested at first. Franklin was British and the North was far away, and Canadian audiences preferred oddities such as Tom Thumb. But over the decades, Franklin had been adopted by Canadians as one of their own. For example, there were the folk songs such as traditional and often sung Ballad of Sir John Franklin, a song not much remembered in England, and Stan Rogers' well-known Northwest Passage. There were contributions to writers. Gwendolyn MacQuinn's radio drama Terror and Erebus was first broadcast in the early 1960s. The poet Alberti was fascinated by Franklin. The novelist and satirist Mordecai Richler considered him an icon ripe for iconoclasm. And in his novel Solomon Gursky Was Here, added a stash of cross-dresser women's clothing to the contents of Franklin's ships. What accounts for such appropriation? Is it that we identify with well-meaning non-geniuses who get tragically messed up by bad weather and evil food suppliers? Perhaps. Or perhaps it's because, as they say in China shops, if you break it, you own it. Canada's North broke Franklin, a fact that appeared to have conferred as ownership title of sorts. It's a pleasure to welcome Frozen in Time back to the bookshelves in this revised and enlarged edition. I hesitate to call it a groundbreaking book, as a pun might be expected, but groundbreaking it has been. It has contributed greatly to our knowledge of a signal event in the history of northern journeying. It also stands as a tribute to the enduring pull of the story, a story that has passed through all forms a story may take. The Franklin saga has been mystery, surmise, rumor, legend, heroic adventure, and national iconography. And here, in Frozen in Time, it becomes a detective story, all the more gripping for being true.